our protocol.
Hi, Ms. Velasquez. I'm fine. How are you doing? Mr. Rayburn.
Yes. We'll just go to her as soon as she comes. How are you? Nice to see you again. Yeah, absolutely. The committee will come to order, and thank you all for coming to this very important hearing. The press for the immediate freedom and repatriation of Mr. Jacob Ostreicher, a U.S. citizen from Brooklyn, New York, who has been detained in Bolivia for 718 days. I especially want to thank and welcome to our committee our distinguished witness, Mr. Sean Penn, for taking time out of a very busy schedule to testify before the subcommittee today. Thank you for being here and for your leadership. This human rights panel in the 112th Congress held 2 congressional hearings on Mr. Ostreicher's case, one in June and the second in August of 2012. The witnesses included Mr. Ostreicher's wife, Miriam Unger, his daughter, Kaya Weinberger, Steve Moore, a retired FBI agent who investigated Mr. Ostreicher's case on a pro bono basis, all 3 of whom are in the audience today, and Mr. Ostreicher's 2 Bolivian attorneys, Mr. Yimi Montano and Mr. Urdes Justiniano, who are not only extraordinarily effective and competent defense lawyers, but very brave as well. The record, including their testimonies, established that Mr. Ostreicher is innocent and is the victim of an elaborate, high-level government extortion ring that fleeced approximately $27 million worth of assets from the rice operation that he had been managing. It is time that Jacob came home to his wife and his family and his friends. Basic justice and humanitarianism, Jacob is, after all, very ill, adds to the urgency that he be freed. In one sense, a lot has happened since the hearing last August. Tragically, Mr. Ostreicher has developed the symptoms of Parkinson's disease, likely due to the sustained, severe stress to which he has been subjected. Immediately following a meeting that I had with Bolivian officials in La Paz last June, including Carlos Romero, Minister of Government, Bolivia started to investigate whether Mr. Ostreicher was the victim of extortion. A total of 27 prosecutors, judges, and officials responsible for confiscated goods who were involved in Mr. Ostreicher's case have now had charges made against them. Currently, 13 of them are in Palomacero prison, 9 are under house arrest, and 5 are fugitives. One of those in prison, Fernando Rivera, is a Ministry of Government advisor who I personally witnessed threaten the judge presiding at one of Mr. Ostreicher's hearings in a Santa Cruz courtroom. Mr. Rivera recently apologized to Mr. Ostreicher during a bail hearing, claimed that he was only following the orders of then Minister of Government Lorente. In one of the many bizarre twists of this story, Mr. Lorente is now the Bolivian representative to the United Nations, living in New York, just a few miles away from Mr. Ostreicher's home. I traveled for a second time to Bolivia in early December, at this time with Congresswoman Ninia Velasquez, to visit Mr. Ostreicher and again press Bolivian officials to either produce the evidence that he had committed a crime or free him. High-level officials assured us that Mr. Ostreicher's case would proceed fairly and expeditiously now that the extortion network had been exposed. Some officials even admitted to us privately that they believed Mr. Ostreicher was innocent. Mr. Penn became involved in the case in October and was instrumental in obtaining desperately needed medical care for Mr. Ostreicher and for helping to secure his release from the infamous Palomacero prison to house arrest, and he did so on December 18th. With Mr. Penn's personal intervention with President Morales and with Mr. Penn in the courtroom, all of us had hoped that Jacob would at long last be released and vindicated at a hearing in December. Inexplicably, that didn't happen. The State Department references Mr. Ostreicher's case in its 2012 Country Reports on Human Rights Practices for Bolivia and notes that the arrest of government officials and the stolen assets as part on its section of arbitrary arrest or detention. In another sense, the most important aspects of the case have not changed. Mr. Ostreicher is still in the custody of the government of Bolivia. On June 4th, it will be 2 years since he was first imprisoned. Bolivian officials are employing delay tactics and giving excuses for his continued detention, and we've heard those before. No evidence whatsoever has been presented to indicate that Mr. Ostreicher is guilty of any crime, and there is no sign of the $27 million of assets from his rice operation that were confiscated. Perhaps this last fact is the real reason why Mr. Ostreicher still is not home with his family in the United States. Recently, there have been reports from credible sources that there is another security threat to Mr. Ostreicher's safety. These followed the sudden removal of Bolivian security officers from the perimeter of Mr. Ostreicher's residence, the day after Mr. Rivera implicated the current Bolivian representative to the UN in the extortion case. As long as Mr. Ostreicher is forced to remain in Bolivia, the government is responsible for and must take all necessary measures to ensure his safety. As a result of the continued injustice in Mr. Ostreicher's case, and also in response to the growing number of cases of Americans living detained abroad in violation of their human and due process rights, I, together with Representative Velasquez, have reintroduced the Justice for Imprisoned Americans Overseas Act, or Jacob's Law. H.R. 1778 would deny visas to foreign government officials responsible for violating the human rights or due process rights of an American in their custody. The travel ban would also apply to the officials' immediate family members. It is wrong for our government to give foreign officials and their families the privilege, and it is a privilege, not a right, to visit and study in the United States while those same officials are wrongfully detaining an American abroad. I would note parenthetically that I wrote a law in 2004 called the Belarus Democracy Act, which does the exact same thing towards the Lukashenko regime in Minsk. While this bill works its way through the legislative process, our committee will continue to pursue every means possible to secure Mr. Ostreicher's safe return to his wife, children, and 11 grandchildren. And that is why we are holding this hearing today. President Morales is flying, as we all know, to Atlanta today for a meeting with former President Jimmy Carter to ask for his assistance in negotiating land access through Chile to the Pacific Ocean. Our hope is, and we have been assured, that the former President of the United States, will raise this issue. I contacted the Carter Center earlier today, and I was told that it was on the agenda, and I'm very, very encouraged by that. It is a very high privilege, though, to have Mr. Penn here with us today, not only because of the fame that he has rightly earned and garnered through his Academy Award-winning acting, and not only because of his highly commendable assistance he is bringing to the suffering people in Haiti through the relief organization that he founded, but also because of the extraordinary assistance that he has provided to Mr. Ostreicher, who he had never met until, of course, he met him in Bolivia. That assistance now includes joining us today, but it is part of a long series of interventions that Mr. Penn has expended on behalf of Jacob Ostreicher. I'd like to now yield to my friend and colleague, Ms. Bass, for any opening comments.
Thank you very much. Chairman Smith, I want to thank you for your leadership of this committee and your continued efforts to elevate human rights issues that require greater attention by Congress and our government. This hearing certainly fits the bill regarding the incarceration of Jacob Ostreicher, a U.S. citizen who for over 2 years has endured a nightmare that is both unfair and unjust. And I'm sorry to say that we're here having this hearing again over so much time. A year ago, this committee learned of Mr. Ostreicher's case and held a hearing to elevate the deplorable injustice that he continues to endure in Bolivia. His wife, daughter, and members of his community sat in this very room and earnestly pleaded for justice and his safe and immediate release. His return to the United States would put an end to the traumatic events that have consumed him and his family for far too long. His return would also bring some sense of normalcy in their lives. This is not too much to ask or demand. I want to thank Mr. Penn for his willingness to travel here and to take action on this issue. I watched the press conference with you and Mr. Ostreicher, and your message was clear. Jacob's human rights have been grossly violated. Those within the Bolivia justice system and those on the fringe have been deeply involved in repeated cycles of abuse, justice, human rights violation, the infringement of one's civil liberties, all of which have gravely impacted him, his family, and I would argue the Bolivian people themselves. We define justice as the pursuit of fairness and a sense of reason. This situation boasts neither fairness or any basic understanding of reason. I urge the Bolivian government to either put forward unequivocal evidence of any crime that he has committed or immediately release him to the U.S. and his family. As far as I'm aware, his assets have been stolen, his business lies in ruin, and he now shows the symptoms of Parkinson's disease, which was visible on the video that I saw when you had the press conference with him. How much more can one person or family endure? I'm pleased that my colleagues, Representative Nadler and Representative Velasquez, are here to show their support and strong commitment. Senators Schumer and Gillibrand have also shown their unwavering commitment to getting him home. They should be commended. There is clear bipartisan and bicameral support for Jacob's release. As I said in my testimony a year ago, Jacob is not forgotten in the U.S. Congress, and we continue to seek an immediate and final end to this terrible situation. Thank you, and I look forward to today's hearing.
Thank you, Ms. Bass. Ms. Velasquez.
Thank you, Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Bass, and members of the subcommittee for holding this important hearing and allowing me to participate. As many of you know, Jacob Ostreicher is an American citizen from Brooklyn, New York. He is currently being held by the Bolivian government for alleged money laundering and ties to criminal organizations. As the congressional representative for many of his family members in New York's 7th District and a fellow Brooklynite, I am extremely concerned by the Bolivian government's failure to provide adequate due process and human rights protection for this man. In fact, I visited Bolivia with Chairman Smith in December to meet with Mr. Ostreicher and discuss his detention directly with high-level Bolivian government officials. While he has been released from prisons since our trip, he remains under house arrest with no foreseeable end to his ordeal. This man has already been detained without due process for the maximum 18 months allowed under Bolivian law. He should have been allowed to return to the U.S. in December. Yet, the government has kept him in the country for an additional 5 months while conducting further investigations, despite the fact the prosecution has produced no evidence whatsoever to support such allegations. The Bolivian government's failure to follow its own law is unacceptable, and he should be released straight away. In order to protect the due process and human rights of Americans in foreign custody, like Mr. Ostreicher, I am an original co-sponsor of Chairman Smith's bill, H.R. 1778, the Justice for Imprisoned Americans Overseas Act, or Jacob's Law. This important legislation will require the State Department to take action when a U.S. citizen's human or due process rights are being violated while in custody of a foreign government. Moreover, the bill prohibits the provision of U.S. assistance to any foreign government that is responsible for the denial of due process and human rights of U.S. citizens in their custody. I look forward to this proposal coming to the House floor and having the opportunity to vote for it. However, due process and human rights are not the only entitlements we need to safeguard. We must also ensure our citizens have access to necessary medical services. That is why I am extremely concerned about the reports of Mr. Ostreicher's deteriorating health and recent Parkinson's disease diagnosis. Bolivia should release him immediately so that he may return to the U.S. to obtain a comprehensive medical evaluation with his own doctors and, of course, be with his family. While I ultimately hope for his swift homecoming, I'm still grateful for the small improvements in this situation. He's no longer incarcerated under the harsh conditions at Palma Sola prison and is receiving some medical treatment in the interim. I would like to take this opportunity to commend Mr. Penn for the measures that he took last December to help him access desperately needed health services and secure bail. Mr. Penn, your presence there meant so much to him, and for that I'm really grateful. Due process is not only an important element of a transparent legal system, it's a human right. It is incumbent upon the U.S. government to protect this right for all American citizens, whether at home or abroad. We must ensure that the Bolivian government upholds its due process laws and return Mr. Ostreicher to the U.S. immediately. And I also would like to add, Mr. Chairman, that how grateful I am for the role that the Bolivian press has played in bringing this case, giving it the high profile that it was much needed with the Bolivian society. And with that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Velasquez, thank you very much. Mr. Nadler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to begin by thanking you and Ranking Member Bass for holding this hearing and for giving me the opportunity to participate, although I'm not a member of the committee. I also would like to thank Sean Penn for his advocacy on behalf of Mr. Ostreicher, which has helped bring international attention to this issue in a way that we couldn't otherwise. I'm here today because my constituent, Jacob Ostreicher, remains in unlawful detention in Bolivia. Along with Mr. Ostreicher's family, friends, and his community in Brooklyn, I am very concerned about his continued confinement and his welfare. As you know, in June 2011, Mr. Ostreicher was arrested in Bolivia on allegations of money laundering and associating with criminal organizations. He was held in the notoriously dangerous Palma Sola prison for 18 months, and though he was released from prison on bail in December of last year, he remains under house arrest. Now, nearly 2 years after he was originally detained, formal charges have yet to be filed against him, and Mr. Ostreicher continues to maintain his innocence. In addition, more than a dozen Bolivian officials, including prosecutors, judges, and the chief legal counsel to the Bolivian Interior Ministry, have since been arrested in connection with corruption in his case, in effect, for attempting to frame Mr. Ostreicher. This amounts to nothing less than a horrible injustice for Mr. Ostreicher, who is in poor health and has been forced to stay in Bolivia, separated from his wife, his 5 children, and 11 grandchildren. This is a man whose life has been unfairly put on hold while justice is denied to him day after day, especially after the people instrumental in accusing him have been accused of corruption by the Bolivian government. It's unfathomable that he continues to be held. The Bolivian authorities must be made immediately aware that this now absurd miscarriage of justice is unacceptable and conveys a negative message about their country to the United States and to the world. In fact, earlier this year, the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights issued a report specifically citing Mr. Ostreicher's case as evidence of endemic corruption within the Bolivian justice system, indicating that Mr. Ostreicher's treatment constitutes a serious human rights abuse. Specifically in reference to Mr. Ostreicher's case, the UN report states, quote, "The existence of an extortion ring within the judiciary constitutes a serious threat to the credibility of the administration of justice," close quote. The Bolivian government must take immediate action to grant Jacob Ostreicher the due process he deserves and show to the world that this sort of injustice will not continue. Since he was first imprisoned, I've been in frequent contact with the State Department about the status of Mr. Ostreicher's case and his condition. I want to thank the State Department for its work thus far in communicating with the Bolivian government regarding Mr. Ostreicher's situation, and to express his frustration and that of our entire government regarding his treatment. That work must continue until we see positive results. In December of last year, after meeting Mr. Ostreicher's wife, Miriam, I wrote a letter to Secretary of State Clinton asking for help communicating to the Bolivian government the necessity of giving Mr. Ostreicher reasonable access to a swift trial. I also wrote a letter, along with my colleagues in the House and Senate, to the Bolivian government making the same request. I understand that Bolivian law has its own standards that allow a prisoner to be held for 18 months on preliminary charges in the pretrial phase if there is a reasonable basis to believe that he or she committed a crime. Now, that 18 months is long past, and they have shown no reasonable basis for believing that a crime was committed by Mr. Ostreicher. Well, I am glad that a Bolivian judge allowed Mr. Ostreicher to be detained at home rather than in prison, at home in Bolivia, that is. Holding someone for 2 years without a trial violates basic standards of fairness and human rights. Mr. Ostreicher is entitled to a fair trial, like anyone else, to see the evidence against him, to have the opportunity to present evidence in his own behalf, and to have that case heard promptly and impartially. If prosecutors do not have the necessary evidence already at hand, they should dismiss the case immediately and let him return to his family in New York. Our job will not be done until Mr. Ostreicher has been accorded the full measure of the simple justice to which everyone is entitled. We need everyone, members of Congress, officials in the executive branch, and other interested parties, to keep up the pressure on the Bolivian government. It's important for everyone to remember our goal, to make sure that Mr. Ostreicher is provided fair treatment and basic due process. The Bolivians must be made to understand that we will not stand idly by and simply accept the treatment that he has received to date. Pressure must continue to be applied to the Bolivian government and its justice system to get Mr. Ostreicher and his family out of the terrible limbo they are in, either by finally giving him the trial he deserves or by dropping the charges and releasing him forthwith. I hope this hearing will serve to do just that, to keep the pressure on the Bolivian government and to demonstrate how important Mr. Ostreicher and his situation are to important U.S. government officials and to the United States government as a whole. And with that, I thank you again, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Senator, thank you very much. It's now an honor and a privilege to welcome to the committee and introduce to the committee Sean Penn. In January of 2010, shortly after a 7.0 magnitude earthquake struck the nation of Haiti, Mr. Sean Penn established the JP Haitian Relief Organization. Today, Mr. Penn directs a predominantly Haitian staff of nearly 400 development professionals to support the residents of the camps of JPHRO, manages and surrounding areas as they transition from life left homeless by the earthquake to durable and sustainable and prosperous communities. This is done through 4 integrated programs: medical, camp and relocation management, engineering and construction, and community development. JPHRO is dedicated to saving lives and bringing sustainable programs to the Haitian people quickly and effectively. And I know Mr. Penn will be traveling to Haiti from here. He is joined today by Ben Krause, Chief of Staff for the organization, and welcome, Ben, as well to the committee. For his efforts, Mr. Penn received numerous awards and honors. He was named Ambassador at Large for Haiti and presented with this honor by the President at a ceremony in Port-au-Prince in 2012. More recently, Mr. Penn was presented with the 2012 Peace Summit Award at the 12th World Summit of Nobel Peace Laureates, a tribute for extraordinary solidarity by the Haitian Parliament in a combined meeting of the National Assembly. There are, in addition to a long list of impressive awards and recognition from the U.S. Army, international humanitarian funds, and others that have flowed to him for his work. In addition to humanitarian work, Mr. Penn, as we all know, has become an American film icon in a career spanning nearly 3 decades, 30 years. Mr. Penn has received 2 Academy Awards and 5 Academy Award nominations for Best Actor. He is also a successful screenwriter, director, producer, and journalist, and we all are very grateful, a great friend of Jacob Ostreicher. Mr. Penn.
Chairman Smith, distinguished members of the committee, I sincerely appreciate your efforts in support of U.S. citizen Jacob Ostreicher and his family, and thank you for allowing me the opportunity to come before you and share my experience regarding Mr. Ostreicher and the increasing urgency of his situation. In 2012, I traveled 3 times to Bolivia. First in February on behalf of the Republic of Haiti in my role as ambassador at large. There I met with President Morales, and I found him a man sincerely dedicated to his people and their economic and social development. It may be instructive to anecdotally recall for you the topics that dominated his part of our conversation. Number 1, the issue of Bolivia's sea rights over ancestral Bolivian lands commandeered by a past Chilean government 150 years ago. Number 2, despite a standing extradition treaty with the United States, the U.S. has steadfastly refused to recognize the treaty as it might require the return of Bolivia's former president, Gonzalo Sanchez de Lozada, who is charged with genocide and currently asylum in the United States, as well as Bolivia's former drug czar, General René Sanabria, who is currently held in the United States. I believe this second point is key to understanding Bolivian skepticism toward any outreach for respect of rule of law or human rights in the case of American Jacob Ostreicher. Number 3, and perhaps most instructive, the Bolivian campaign to educate those outside the region on the cultural and economic value of their dominant coca crop. I will not sit here today as an advocate for any of these 3 primary concerns, though I will briefly quote from a blog piece I published shortly after that trip. While indeed coca leaf is the base material for the production of cocaine, it resembles cocaine only so much as does the fertilizer so accessible and profitable in the United States, so necessary for our own farming community, and its regrettable relativity as the base material for explosives. Bolivia's campaign, seeking markets for export for the multiple benign uses of coca leaf, reads, "Coca no es cocaína." And the economic impact on Bolivia of this largely puritanical misconception is tremendous and translates to human hardship that is palpable in that country. Further, it inflames the uninformed perceptions that connect Bolivia's leadership with the criminal narco-trafficking that Bolivia itself is so dedicated to abate. Since this indigenous president assumed office in 2006, and while the United Nations General Assembly designated President Morales World Hero of Mother Earth in 2010, internal Bolivian opposition media, political and economic powers have continuously exploited our own internal propaganda, leveraging the false perception of drug lordship and totalitarianism against this elected leader of this democratic socialist country. As a result, the U.S. media has ignored the rest of the story in Bolivia, including the tremendous reforms that have been enacted under President Morales' leadership, including a new constitution, embracing human rights at its core. Furthermore, even the case of Mr. Ostreicher garners a paucity of attention. An article just last week on CNN.com listing Americans unjustly held overseas failed to make mention of Mr. Ostreicher's case in spite of this subcommittee's repeated efforts to bring the injustice to national attention and peaceful resolution. My second trip to Bolivia in October of 2012 resulted from a call from a colleague who had been contacted on behalf of the imprisoned American Jacob Ostreicher. Based on my brief history with President Morales, I was asked to review the Ostreicher case, and having done so to my absolute satisfaction in his innocence, bring the case to President Morales. I began by reviewing the report of former FBI investigator Steve Moore, consulted with Mr. Ostreicher's Bolivian attorneys, as well as his Washington-based law firm representing he and his family pro bono, and discussing the matter with Mr. Ostreicher's wife, Miriam Unger. All of these people have provided testimonies to this subcommittee before, and I would strongly encourage all of the new members to review the testimonies provided on June 6 and on August 1, 2012, so as to better inform yourselves to the injustice of Mr. Ostreicher's situation. I continued my investigation, discussing the matters with members of the United States State Department, and made inquiries to my Venezuelan and Bolivian colleagues. Finally, I thoroughly reviewed the situation on the ground myself in Bolivia. Following all of this, I was not only personally and thoroughly convinced of Mr. Ostreicher's innocence, but particularly alarmed by a consensus both among Bolivian officials as well as the international sources that the unevidenced prosecution of Jacob Ostreicher was SOP, standard operating procedure, in the fundamentally corrupt Bolivian judiciary. At that point, I requested a second meeting with President Morales. In that meeting in La Paz, I was able to share with the President the materials that had been provided me, as well as additional information I had garnered from multiple sources. I will subject my intuition to your judgment. I was convinced then, and I remain convinced today, that these findings were received by the President with tremendous personal and human grief, that the President had indeed inherited a judiciary that at once is populated by brave and ethical servants of the Bolivian people and the rule of law, but that within it, a mafia-proportioned criminal network referred to as La Red in Bolivia maintains a devastating grip on power, extortion, narco-trafficking, and human cruelty. I was not educating a president, but I was witnessing one who, like any president, faces the multifaceted challenges of governance. This president was being asked by an American friend to put laser attention on a single case, but one that he knew and that I would come to know reflected the challenge and gravitas of the situation at large for the Bolivian government and its people in respect to their judiciary. President Morales, in my presence, immediately called his Minister of Government, who, without hesitation, referred to the case of Mr. Ostreicher, and I quote, as a bad case. Following that meeting, the Bolivian government, ordered by President Morales, gave new empowerment to the investigatory body, the judiciary, which resulted in the arrests and imprisonments of over 20 Bolivian officials, including Fernando Rivera, a primary representative of the Ministry of Government in the prosecution of Mr. Ostreicher. What had been exposed was an unprecedented ring of extortion. Indeed, Mr. Ostreicher's only crime was to have brought a successful rice concession and well-paying jobs to poor Bolivians. Upon the criminal actions of the judiciary, the rice and heavy equipment was commandeered and sold for personal profit, and jobs for poor Bolivians evaporated. While the principal investor in Mr. Ostreicher's business venture, Swiss businessman André Zolti, was determined to be conducting legitimate and transparent business practices through an investigation by Interpol, and while Mr. Ostreicher had been able to account for every penny, demonstrate that all funds had legally and with full transparency been channeled through the Bolivian Central Bank, and that all funds had subsequently been invested legally and with the same transparency, it was Mr. Ostreicher who was carted off to prison in Santa Cruz called Palmasola. Palmasola prison is described as a modern-day Dante's Inferno. 4,500 inmates that they themselves run. The corrections officers are limited to perimeter patrol and roll checks. It's a prison that receives delivery of body bags to the front gate on a weekly basis and feeds its prisoners 18 cents worth of mulchi broth twice daily through a trough. Disease, violence, and humiliation. In this prison, Mr. Ostreicher lost 55 pounds, a full third of his body weight, and suffered the onset of Parkinson's disease and was subject to tremendous physical violence by guards and fellow inmates. In addition to enabling the arrests of La Red extortion network, President Morales also ordered an emergency medical examination for Mr. Ostreicher. I flew to Santa Cruz, where I met with Minister of Government Carlos Romero and his Vice Minister Jorge Perez. With the support of President Morales and the assistance of Mr. Ostreicher's Bolivian attorneys, Minister Romero and Vice Minister Perez were able to expedite the doctor's examination. We went to Palmasola at 1 a.m. that same night and stood witness as the Bolivian state-appointed doctor made the determination that Mr. Ostreicher was at life risk and signed the papers ordering that he be transported to a private medical clinic for immediate and continuing treatment. On my third visit to La Paz in December 2012, I was scheduled to meet with President Morales and Vice President Linera in advance of Jacob's hearing the following day. At the diplomatic home of Venezuelan Ambassador to Bolivia, Chris Gonzalez, we were informed that the meeting would no longer be necessary, as Mr. Ostreicher's hearing in Santa Cruz the following morning was assumed to be that which would secure his release and exoneration. We were flown by military transport that evening to Santa Cruz. The following morning at the courthouse, we were brought to a waiting room where, despite our optimism, Mr. Ostreicher, who was then in a minimally improved physical state, wearing the required body armor that acknowledged the Bolivian state's own concern for his safety in light of the criminal elements within their own judiciary, Constrained by his own disability to a wheelchair with hands shaking from Parkinson's disease, nonetheless had clarity of mind that our optimism had stolen from us. As we prepared for the arrival of the judge and the hearing to take place, I imparted to him, based on what I had been told in La Paz, that he would very soon be seeing his wife, his 5 children, and his 11 grandchildren, from whom he'd been significantly parted for 2 years. He said to me, "It won't happen, Sean. These expletives want to kill me. I'm too dangerous to them as a witness." At that point, we were notified that the judge would soon enter the court, and I assisted Mr. Ostreicher in his wheelchair into the courtroom. As an actor, I've been in good movies and I've been in bad movies. I've never seen a worse movie or more arch villainy on such a caricaturish and humanly diabolical level as I witnessed in that courtroom. Despite the clear and unequivocal arguments of innocence, and more importantly, evidence of innocence brought by Mr. Ostreicher's Bolivian defense team, the judge, under the clear intimidation of a panel of snickering, arrogant, and hateful prosecutors, would have none of either logic nor law. With Mr. Ostreicher still too frail to be touched without tremendous pain through his bone contact with his paper-thin skin, and the Parkinson's mixed with a heightened stress anxiety creating intense shaking, the prosecution dared even to challenge the Bolivian state doctor's medical diagnosis and claimed that Mr. Ostreicher was perfectly healthy and pushed for him to be returned to the death factory of Palmasola prison. What followed was a very challenging negotiation to keep Mr. Ostreicher in the clinic so as to keep him from being returned to Palmasola prison, and where we stand today through the diligent work of both his Bolivian and American attorneys and the dedicated support of this committee and of Governor Bill Richardson, and indeed the cautious support of President Morales and his Venezuelan counterparts. Mr. Ostreicher is remanded to house arrest. While his weight and mobility have returned to something close to normal, the Parkinson's, quite likely triggered by the stress in his time in Palmasola prison, remains of debilitating concern, and he is in daily fear for his life, further exacerbating his Parkinson's. It's high time Mr. Ostreicher's elderly parents, wife, children, and grandchildren receive him back in the United States to move on with their lives. This tragic scenario is not Bolivia. It's not the Bolivian people. It's not the Bolivian president. What it is an example of the continuing of Bolivia's 100 years of struggle in its fight for human rights and its revolution for freedom. In that revolution, Bolivians have demonstrated an extraordinary courage and will for sacrifice. It is on that basis and in solidarity with President Morales and the Bolivian people that I offer the following. Last week, registration opened for the Dakar Rally. As the off-road driving enthusiasts among us know, the Dakar Rally is one of the premier rally raid cross-country driving competitions in the world. Started more than 30 years ago as a race from Paris, France, along the Sahara to the desert in Dakar, Senegal. Each year, the Dakar Rally brings together hundreds of competitors in the motorcycle, car, and truck classes to compete in a 2-week race covering thousands of miles of the world's roughest terrain. For host countries, the Dakar Rally brings hundreds of thousands of dollars in charitable donations, millions of spectators and tourists, hundreds of millions of dollars in economic activity, and billions of viewers from 190 countries through global broadcasting. While the net impact of the rally is at times controversial, many have shared sentiments that, like the government of Peru, which declared the rally a national interest, and the Argentine Minister of Tourism, who called the rally the biggest promotional tool for tourism in Argentina's history. For the past 4 years, the Dakar Rally has been racing through South America, and in January of 2014, for the first time ever, part of the race is scheduled to traverse southern Bolivia, making Bolivia the 28th host country in the rally's history. In fact, just last month, rally organizers competed in a dress rehearsal across Bolivia's famous salt flats. The Dakar Rally, one of the world's most prominent displays of freedom and tenacity of the human spirit, will be parading through Bolivia, even as thousands of prisoners like Mr. Ostreicher sit in feces-filled cells, forgotten behind locked walls and surrounded by the sort of inhuman savagery we only dream is possible in existential nightmares. The Dakar Rally is scheduled to celebrate the triumphs of the human spirit and innovation on the same soil where the Bolivian justice system festers and loots the same from its innocent and uncharged victims. The Economist has reported that at least 2/3 of the prison population in Bolivia is on remand, awaiting trial. Awaiting trial. So I ask you, the distinguished members of this committee, join me in calling on the sponsors of the Dakar Rally to bring their influence to bear for the thousands of innocent victims of the Bolivian justice system, and especially for Jacob Ostreicher. Starting with the official partner of the Dakar Rally, the petrochemical giant Total, and then moving to each of the official partners, Michelin, Honda, Mitsubishi Motors, Red Bull, Edox, Karcher, Agreco, and even the official race photographer, Maindrew Photo. I ask that you influence to call on these sponsors to insist that their support for the Dakar Rally will either require Mr. Ostreicher is finally freed to return to the United States, and as Mr. Nadler mentioned, the 18 months allowed by Bolivian Constitution to be held without charge has already passed, and so there should be no discussion that could give opening to too late offers of an expedited trial. Freed as a first sign of goodwill, and the intention on the part of the Bolivian government and the ethical within its judicial institutions as they continue the long and difficult process of justice and reform, or the Dakar Rally will not enter Bolivia. I am confident in the good people in these companies do not want to support the perpetual imprisonment of innocents and will recognize the necessity of principled withdrawal should the government of Bolivia fail to act. But they should do this for practical reasons too. Imagine the tragedy if one of their own people or one of the tourists following the rally while it passes through Bolivia were to become victims like Jacob and land behind bars without charges, without evidence against them, and without rights. As 2014 will be the first time that the rally ventures into Bolivia, this first test run will only consist of one stage of the motorcycle class venturing across the Bolivian salt flats. This is to say that if the Bolivian justice system continues to deny Mr. Ostreicher the freedom that they themselves have indicated he is due, since they have not brought any legitimate charges against him, it is still possible for the Dakar Rally to exclude Bolivia. The international pressure could very well be precisely what the President of Bolivia needs to be able to finally expel the malignant cancer of corruption that is killing both the Bolivian justice system and the thousands of innocent people like Mr. Ostreicher. But putting a clear cost for the continued abuse of the justice system on the economic elites of the country may well be giving President Morales and the people of Bolivia the leverage needed to advance their heroic fight for freedom and justice in Bolivia to the next level. So again, I ask that you all join me in calling on the sponsors of the Dakar Rally, Total, Michelin, Honda, Mitsubishi Motors, Red Bull, Edox, Karcher, Agreco, and Maindrew Photo to demand Jacob's freedom as a condition of their support for the Dakar Rally in Bolivia. A last thought came from a telephone call that I had with a friend of high rank in the United States military. After spending most of his military career in South America and the Caribbean, he was later deployed to a post in South Asia, and after several months of deployment, we spoke. He said that he had always considered the challenges of the Caribbean and Latin America nearly insurmountable until experiencing his new position focused on South Asia and the Middle East. His realization of how much commonality the United States, Latin America, and the Caribbean share, he said, should make this butter. It is my hope that Bolivia and the United States will take the lead in a new era of diplomacy and human rights for that which is our shared human interest, that Cuba will follow with the release of Alan Gross, and that the United States will refocus its diplomatic consideration on the Cuban Five without regard for fundamentalist opposition within political constituencies. Bolivia has a rare opportunity to trigger the movement of a new day where the discussion of human rights is a discussion without borders. Thank you.
Mr. Penn, thank you very much for that extraordinarily eloquent but also very bold statement. Not only did you lay out all of the very real and tangible efforts that you have made and others have made, encouraging, asking, petitioning but now I believe you have given a means to a very positive outcome with the Dakar rally recommendation. I can tell you that we will circulate a letter pursuant to your recommendation to the sponsors and ask that they, again, not allow this very important rally, this great economic boom to occur within Bolivia until Jacob is freed. So I think this could be a game changer. It ought to be. The persuasion has years to date now, almost 2 years, has not worked. So I think you bring to the table an enormous next step. And for that, I believe all of us are very grateful for that recommendation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you so much for that. You know, it does underscore another issue, you know, how any non-Bolivian and even Bolivian business investor could have any confidence that doing business in Bolivia might not make them the next Jacob Ostreicher. It is a very real threat to them, and so I think you have laid out a course of action that we will follow up on, and I do thank you for that. Without leverage, you know, jawboning and recommendations, even friendships, only go so far. So thank you for that. If you wanted to elaborate any further on the idea, but we will circulate a letter. I do hope it will be bipartisan. I know that, and I know you will. And I think that will be very, very effective to at least get us on record.
Thank you.
Let me just ask you, you know, you talk about the judicial system, and I'm glad you bring a very, very sharp focus there. In my first press conference with the Bolivian press last June, I had known of so many other cases that were just like Jacob's but non-American, and said that look at Jacob as a means to an end of getting the judicial system up to world-class standards, international standards of fundamental human rights, due to process rights. And as you said, Lared, you know, the idea that this nefarious organization, this network, continues to not only hurt Jacob, but it hurts Bolivian people. And one of the points I made to the Bolivian press was that we stand in solidarity with the press in Bolivia, just as we do with Jacob. And so join us in trying to push for reform. And I think your point was very well taken on that one as well. No one should be behind bars ever, anywhere, who is innocent. You know, we're not having hearings about Americans who are committing crimes. We're having hearings and promoting innocent Americans, or anyone else for that matter, who are being prosecuted unjustly. So I think your point on that one as well. Just one question, and any comment to that you might want to make. We've tried to get the United Nations to do more, other organizations. We know that Dennis Rassicot is there. I've met with him. Ms. Nydia Velasquez and I have met with him. But we know that the UN itself is under pressure and runs a risk and has a certain fear that its own personnel might be retaliated against. But it seems to me that in New York, the Human Rights Council ought to be taking up Jacob's case, and the U.S. should be promoting that as well, because when other levers don't work, international organizations certainly provide a potential remedy. So if you wanted to speak to that.
Yeah, well, I think that there are several institutions and government organizations who may be able to contribute their good offices and the influence there. Bolivia is a very poor country, as we know, and it does demand an enormous amount of economic support in various sectors. So I think that there is that. At the same time, I came to this hearing today a little bit ambivalent, simply because there is such a perspective shift culturally that when they are challenged, especially by either citizens or government officials in the United States, there is an inclination towards, let's say, self-destructive, to this level of self-destructive defiance. In the kind of populism that is typical of the region, leaderships often have to appeal on the basis of that defiance towards the United States. And I think that, again, you know, that in looking forward on these kinds of negotiations in future, This is really a time, as we become increasingly global, I think it makes a lot of sense for us to adjust our view related to our own human rights abuses in this country, and also within the kind of any kind of a sort of the black and white hold-ons that maintain small groups dictating the policy at large that affects the perception of the United States worldwide. There are compromises to be made. There are, you know, I brought up the Cuban Five. Clearly, there are some within the Cuban Five who are seemingly guilty of higher offenses than others. But these are the kinds of diplomatic things that we really need to start working towards a fresh start with, so that we don't have a defiant leadership in these countries the next time something happens, and that would, I think, further empower the State Department to take a more active role. At this point, I think it is fair to say that despite criticism the State Department has had, even the case of Mr. Ostreicher, my experience there is that they've been very diligent and yet very cautious, and rightly so, because their public position taken against this government is that which quickly can inflame the situation rather than diffuse it.
Ms. Bess, thank you.
Once again, Mr. Penn, thank you very much for your testimony, and I particularly appreciated your testimony providing a context, and especially a historical context in terms of our relationship with Bolivia, the sensitivity of that, the new leadership in the country, and also the precarious position that the President finds himself in. So I wanted to ask you a couple of questions along those lines. One, in terms of if you believe that U.S.-Bolivian relationships partially contributed to Mr. Ostreicher's imprisonment, and then your call for us to do a letter. I was speaking with Chairman Smith and said, I'm more than willing to sign on to a letter, and maybe that letter actually calls for the companies you talked about to withdraw their involvement unless he's released. On the other hand, the flip side of that is what you were just talking about. I'm happy to do that if you think it would be helpful. On the other hand, I would just be a little concerned that that could inflame things or even perhaps compromise President Morales. You described him as being, you know, genuinely concerned about the situation, and so that begs the question of why couldn't he just order the release? And so is the reason because he's in part receiving the pressure from LARED? Is that what you referred to them as?
Yes. Well, this would be you're referring to the criminal network within the judiciary. Yeah.
Right. So I guess I'm asking if you do think that's a good idea to ask for it to be that strong, to withdraw their involvement, which could certainly compromise, you know, the economic benefit to the country. Would that be helpful, or would that be, you know, a contributing factor to inflaming?
I think, as with anything, there is a threshold, and it is my opinion that the threshold has been crossed in terms of the incarceration of Jacob Ostreicher. Not only to the deficit of Mr. Ostreicher, but to the Bolivian people and the future of its institution of judicial process. I think that what I was insinuating was not so much that President Morales was cautious related to the reaction or the influence of the Red, but in particular that in the same way that leaderships throughout the world are vulnerable to opposition media. The media is a rabid dog there, and they are largely run by opposition forces and influenced by opposition forces to this democratically elected leader of his people. So I by no means am suggesting a lack of courage on the half, in fact, quite the contrary. But in terms of political strategy, he is caught between a rock and a hard place, is my perception of this, and that and also those ministers, those good ministers within the judiciary, in that as soon as they stand up and say, you know, they believe that Jacob Ostreicher should be released, or he is innocent of these charges, or in fact, as is the case, there is no evidence whatsoever against Mr. Ostreicher, it starts to be rumored that they are representatives of narco-trafficking. And so within that, it's that internal struggle that's never going to be broken until the strategy is based on principle. And the simple principle here is that if there's going to be an enormous amount of money generated in a country that's doing this, a country where human rights is the low-hanging fruit of the yearning of the actual leadership and the people, well then, in fact, they're inviting such solidarity, and as I read it, that these companies do just that and make the decision with the very clear thought that it is simply wrong to continue to support it.
Sure, because there's different degrees. We could call on them to speak out, or we could call on
Yeah,
them.
and we're not really asking that they suddenly revolutionize the judiciary, but that we have a difficult time doing that here, or our school systems,
you.
or any of. We know that it's difficult. Governance is difficult. What we are saying is show the first step. Here is the easiest case you have. The man is clearly innocent. Even your officials within the judiciary acknowledge that. As I said, this is a bad case. That's what he meant. We have no case. We're just holding him. Okay. Release him now.
I also wanted to ask you, while you were in Bolivia, did you have any interaction with our embassy and its staff? And also the fact that we don't have an ambassador in place. I didn't know what level of involvement or participation they had in your visits.
Well, as you know, President Morales recently ousted
Yes.
the USAID,
Yes.
And I think that is, further representation of the kind of concerns. One that starts with what has been a history of intervention, often, I think, very negligent intervention on the part of the United States, both in Bolivia and other countries in South America. This is embedded in the spirit of the people and of their leaders. And I think in struggling for a new day, certainly we need ambassadors. We need them there. We need them in Venezuela. But yes, I had some limited interaction with what again had appeared to be a very supportive charge d'affaires at the embassy in Santa Cruz, or in Bolivia. But as my particular interest at the time was in communicating separate from that, because I didn't want to mix the issues too much, I spent most of the time with Bolivian officials here.
I see. And then last question, a slightly different topic, though, but in terms of what the president did a couple of weeks ago, I think it was at least a couple of weeks ago when he expelled USAID, how did you read that? I mean, did you read that as President Morales doing that because he needed to take a stand against the U.S., or did you ever hear of particular concerns? Was there some legitimacy to that? People were upset about something USAID had done?
I think, as it goes region to region, that the investment of USAID, or the commitments of USAID there, were not on such a level that it couldn't be used politically. At the same time, I'm more inclined to take the president at his word, and I think that he, I think he's fed up with what would be considered, hegemony.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Chair recognizes the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Engel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and let me once again thank you for your really hard work and determination in this particular case. You have been doing so much of this for so long that everyone really should know it. And Mr. Penn, I want to thank you for adding star power to this. It's really very, very important. It's frustrating for us. We try to get people to focus on it, but everyone's going in a million different directions. And as the ranking member on the full committee, I want to just thank you for coming here. It's very, very, very good of you. The case obviously is heartbreaking. The injustice on Jacob Ostreicher and his family is difficult to fully grasp. And when he was detained under murky circumstances in Bolivia in 2011, no one could have imagined that to this day he would be prevented from going home to New York. It is now clear, as was said here, that Jacob was the victim of a sordid extortion ring, and multiple arrests have been made in the case, and we fully expected these arrests would be followed by his release but unfortunately, he's in a legal spiral. And even though the prosecution has never presented evidence against him, he's now been held in Bolivia for 718 days. I've met with Evo Morales on different occasions, once right here in this building in my office, once in Bolivia. I'd certainly be willing to meet with him again. What's happening here is reflecting very poorly on Bolivia, its legal system and its government. And you know, I had said to President Morales, he threw out our ambassador, this is several years ago, and kicked out our drug agents, and seemed to feel that things could go on as usual, normal as usual. It really cannot be the case, and it's difficult for our governments to have relations as usual as long as Jacob Ostreicher is there. Mr. Penn, you visited Mr. Ostreicher in Bolivia. You've appeared by his side in some very difficult moments, and I think your humanity is something that we all really admire. I see Miriam here, Jacob's wife, and it's good to see you. I hope that next time we'll see each other and celebrate in New York after he's been released. Jimmy Carter, former president, is meeting with Morales today, and I hope I wish him luck in advocating for Jacob. Mr. Penn, I wanted to ask you, we have very little cards to play. The United States has very little cards to play. It's frustration because very little cards to play. What should we be doing that we haven't done? I know we've all tried. Certainly, the chairman has gone there and made it a cause célèbre of his, and we've tried to focus attention on, you know, in a situation like this, we're not so sure if we make noise about it, if it's good for Jacob, or if we are quiet about it, if it's good for Jacob. You don't really kind of know what to do. You know, you don't want to be quiet and then nothing happens. You don't want to make noise and then Morales or whomever gets offended. You have to try to find the right mix. In your opinion, because you've been doing this and you have been out in front on this, what should we be doing here in the Congress that we haven't done, or the government that we haven't done?
I think this returns to the question from Ms. Bass, because I would agree this is it's treacherous territory when going public in any way on these things. There is, and I say this with nothing but regard, a great humility in the culture that is exemplified by someone, for example, like President Morales. And when statements are made that seem to be continuations of the ideologies and the entitlements and what fairly could be called the arrogances of misguided policies, historically or currently, we always have to be very cautious. When talking about, for example, a letter on the Dakar rally, I think you should know, if I'm speaking as fairly as I can, that my opinion on that is based on the belief, and I do not think that in any way this is over-dramatizing or exaggerating the situation. I believe Jacob's life is in danger as we sit here today. The people whose own freedom is at risk, both those at large and currently in prison and facing charges, are people who have played very serious baseball. And this would not be by, you know, it's very hard for us sitting in the United States to understand just how fast a 37-set bullet can fly. I think that we're at a point now, we don't want to look back and say we shoulda. So what is our option? I think, for example, to recognize it and to do it as I recommend it, which is in solidarity with what the government itself claims to be in pursuit of. There is that. I can tell you, simply based on the kind of chatter conversations one has traveling in these regions, I think that it would be a very, very powerful step for the United States to look to negotiate the release of one or more of the Cuban Five. This is, I think that we always have to look at the result, and the result, both for someone like Jacob Ostreicher, as well as for Alan Gross in Cuba, of the United States being the one to step up. By no means am I suggesting that Bolivia be given a pause while that's considered. But I think we really have to add some perspective. We know that our country has about 28% of its citizens total with passports at all, and we can all fall into what becomes an inherently limited perspective analysis of the world. We could do better. We could do better this way.
Would you think that, in your opinion, would it be possibly helpful if we made it clear, if our government made it clear, that the release of Mr. Ostreicher would lead to a rapprochement with Bolivia? You know, we've had, as I said, very strained relations since our ambassadors have been out, and drug agents and everything, the cooperation that we had with Bolivia for many, many years. Evo Morales made a point when we met with him, because I also brought a delegation down there, that he used to be the president of the Coca Farmers Union, and made it a big point about how he is for the rights of the downtrodden. You know, I can't think of anyone more downtrodden right now than Jacob Ostreicher. Should we be indicating to him, and I know a lot of this is obviously done behind the scenes and not done at hearings, but that his release would lead to a rapprochement, that we have a lot of things that we could offer Bolivia, and this might be a step in the right direction, and takes two to tango, and we could probably tango together.
Yes, and it's my feeling that that could be done in a very genuine way, because in all of the conversations that I've had, and I'm talking bipartisan groups related to this within government, within the United States government, there is an enormous will to embrace the selected indigenous president of that country, a tremendous will. But as long as Bolivia and its judiciary, or the president, you know, even in effect, takes covered, you know, behind an institution that has an internal revolution going on within it of corruption, we won't be able to. I wouldn't expect that our government officials would get very far with their constituencies. I think that he has to make this first move. I hope he does for Bolivia's sake. I hope he does for his sake and his leadership's sake.
Well, I think that's very well put, and I would certainly concur with what you said. You know, the final thing I want to say is that, you know, very much in the past several years, the policies of Bolivia have been wrapped around the policies of Venezuela, and the two governments have been working in tandem. Obviously, there's in Venezuela, with the long-standing leader passing away, I would hope that this case could lead perhaps to Evo Morales really kind of standing up on his own and breaking out on his own, and showing that, you know, he's nobody's number two person. He's branching out and going to be number one in terms of dealing with the United States. I would say that I would hope to do everything that might be able to be done to help facilitate that. I just hope that he would understand that I think there's a big chance now with Hugo Chavez being gone, that the United States and Bolivia could perhaps reach out again, and cooperation. And what better way to start than by releasing Jacob Ostreicher?
Yeah, I would only, if I may, I would only caution that the pursuit of that from the United States side must be very sensitive to the understanding that it's not because it wasn't available due to President Chavez, but this is always going to be a two-sided. It's not going to be that they're going to be necessarily more in line ideologically with what we as the United States want them to be, but in fact that there has been an existing potential diplomatic relationship far exceeding that which either side has been successful in accomplishing for reasons of stigma and propaganda, and because we suffered. I think one of the great enemies of Jacob Ostreicher today has been one of the greatest challenges we face throughout the world, which is the media perversion of the circumstances. When the media perverts the circumstances, then our own politicians are also influenced, as we are talking about President Morales being. I can tell you of a circumstance. You know, we were involved. President Chavez helped very directly with the 3 U.S. hikers who were in Iran, and it was then Minister of Foreign Affairs Maduro and his then deputy Tamir Porras, with whom I met and who directly went to Iran to negotiate with the supreme leader following failed negotiations with President Ahmadinejad. So here was the Venezuelans meeting me at the airport in New York City on behalf of 3 Americans who were arrested in Iran. It just takes a little respect to get a long way, particularly as in these regions that I would concur with my military friend who I was quoting before, with whom we have so much more in common than we do in difference.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Penn. I've always been a fan of yours for other reasons, but now I'm really a fan of yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Engel. Ms. Velasquez.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Penn, thank you so much for bringing a unique perspective that sometimes is lacking when we are dealing with issues concerning Latin America. You know, here we are. Sometimes we support and encourage democratic processes throughout the world. But when those democratic processes produce results that we don't like, then it brings a different dynamic. And sometimes cases like Mr. Ostreicher are linked to those dynamics, whether we like it or not. I hope that from this moment forward, we seize our opportunity as a government to improve our relationships with Latin America and deal as equal, because that is important. So, as a private citizen, Mr. Penn, you have a unique access to this case. You have had. My question to you is, given what you know, given all the meetings that you have held with officials and the president, now they're saying that he's going to be held under house arrest for 5 more months. Do you see any light at the end of the tunnel in terms of a resolution that gets him home within those 5 months, or you foresee that it might take longer?
As long as the leadership maintains that this is under the authority of the judiciary, and claims a position that they have no legal recourse outside of that. My experience with and witness of that judiciary is I would have absolutely no faith on earth that he will ever leave Bolivia if it is left to that.
Mm-hmm. You have worked in so many worthy causes, from victims in Haiti at the earthquake in 2010 to Hurricane Katrina in 2005. Could you take a moment and tell us what compelled you to advocate for Jacob Ostreicher?
A colleague, the actor Mark Wahlberg, had called me. I think that my understanding is that he had had some philanthropic activities with some of the rabbis from Mr. Ostreicher's synagogue, and asked, I think initially he had asked if I might bring the case to President Chavez. And I, at that point, I informed him that I might be able to bring it directly to President Morales, which is what I did. And as I said, it was, you know, it's, I can give you a very simple answer. It timed at a point when I could pay attention to it. And in paying attention to it, I couldn't stop paying attention to it.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Dent.
Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me again start by thanking you, Mr. Penn, for your activism in this and in so many other things. And let me ask you a few questions. You said the President President Morales is fed up with what he considers hegemony. You're referring to the hegemony of the United States or of the judiciary?
Of the United States.
Of the United States. And in light of that, you've suggested that American companies could put pressure on the government by threatening to pull out of the Dakar rally. Do you think that there's a real risk that that would be viewed as more hegemony and might backfire, or is that something we ought to try?
Well, the companies themselves are not only U.S. companies. I think that, you know, that this can come in a variety of ways. I would like to consider, and I think that myself, in consultation with other supporters of Mr. Ostreicher, will send out a request for citizens on an international level to support this and to make these reach outs to these companies. I'd like to talk directly and attempt to talk directly to these companies and people who serve on the boards of these companies. But again, it goes back to the threshold consideration, and that there has been quite a concerted effort on behalf of Mr. Ostreicher in a situation where virtually nothing else has worked or made sense. I mean, I think that talking to anyone that's been in proximity to this case, it really makes no sense. And aside from Mr. Ostreicher and his family, the damage it's doing is so particularly to the leadership in Bolivia and to the people. This is, I believe, a wake-up call because it goes very much to the beneficiaries of that investment are going to start with those who are in the opposition.
Thank you. Do you think the President realizes how much this is damaging Bolivia?
No, I don't think so. I think that the President's area of expertise is very, very rich, and his areas of deference to the expertise of others is fairly weighted as well. And I have minimal faith in many of the others who surround the President.
And okay, and now you either said or implied before that you thought the President Morales, thought that Mr. Ostreicher's treatment had been unfair, but that he had deferred to the judiciary. Now, I don't know what the situation is in Bolivia. Maybe you do, and that's why I'm going to ask you the question. In this country and in many countries, the prosecutors are agents of the executive branch, not of the judiciary. Is that the case in Bolivia? I mean, could the President simply tell the prosecutors to drop the case?
Say it again, I'm sorry?
Could the President simply tell the prosecutors to drop the case? Are they agents, are the prosecutors part of the judiciary, or are they agents of the executive branch in Bolivia?
It's my understanding that once the 18 months passed, that this could come down from the executive branch.
So we have to convince the President that he could do it on his own without taking on the judiciary.
Yes.
Let me ask you one other question. Okay, so your judgment is that we should pursue this Dakar rally despite some risk of blowback.
There's no question there's risk of blowback.
But we should, but the odds are that we should pursue it.
That's my feeling.
Okay. Let me ask you another thing. Did you, in talking to people in Bolivia, to the president, did you get any blowback on a different way that who the heck are you Americans to be talking about someone held for 2 years without trial when you've held hundreds of people in Guantanamo for 10 years without trial? Is this affecting this?
Yeah, all these things affect us, and it is part of the daily conversation. In fact, in my own personal circumstances, when I had taken, after the kind of would-be joke, were it not so tragic, hearing that I described in my initial statement, there were a collection of those who had been involved, and the lawyers, embassy staff, U.S. embassy staff, Venezuelan embassy staff, and Bolivian government there. It was at that time that Mr. Ostreicher had decided that the only way to approach this, and it's from him I take most of my guidance in answering your questions about, though I have not discussed the Dakar rally with him. I was concerned about discussing it prior to coming and doing the testimony, but I had discussed and had, at his request, participated in going public. It is his general feeling that it's—
His, meaning Mr. Ostreicher's?
Yes. And it was he that requested that we do a press conference the day following that mockery of a hearing. When we did so, I can tell you that after passing my prepared statements that I had written that night before by the Minister of Communications for the Bolivian government, as well as several authorities within the judiciary, as well as those representing the other governments who were participating in support, even after getting all of my statements a kind of sign-off, because I was looking to be very careful about how I did it, the blowback, which started with the media response and the media manipulation of the things that I had said, and the way that it was being used, to misinform a challenged literacy population, worked very much against the President, and the President was very upset by the statement I made, and no doubt will be upset by the statements I've made today. I want to go on record saying I have an enormous respect for President Morales and a great affection for the man, but I just feel that my responsibility as a human being is with Jacob Ostreicher on this issue, and I do think that President Morales can only benefit from all of us speaking out at this point, because I think that he is surrounded, he is, like many world leaders, challenged by a bubble and by corrupt forces within his own administration.
Well, we have to hope that you're right, and we will pursue that, obviously. And again, thank you for your efforts in this and in so many other things. I yield back.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Nadler. And thank you, Mr. Penn, for your, I think, extraordinary testimony. I think your point, challenged by a bubble. What a way to put it. He needs to know what's going on, doesn't necessarily get the kind of information that would make a difference. And I really believe, and I hope the press takes note, you come here as a friend to Evo Morales. Much of his politics, it wouldn't be something I would agree with, but this is not about any of that. It is all about Jacob Ostreicher, a man whose life is at grave risk. Justice demands it, humanitarianism demands it, and I do think for Evo Morales and the government to step up and release him now is enlightened self-interest. It is harming the reputation of the Bolivian government. I would disagree with you about the opposition. I do believe oppositions, no matter where they are, play whether it be in the United States or anywhere else, a constructive role. I never think of my Democratic friends as the enemy. We are the loyal opposition, and vice versa. And I do think they play a very good role. And I know there are certain members of the opposition who are facing charges themselves, Senator Pinto, for example, and many others. It ought to be all about an absolutely unassailable judiciary that just looks at wrongdoers, lawbreakers, I should say, and then prosecutes them.
Yes, if I mistakenly generalized that, certainly there are, I didn't mean it in a blanket sort of way.
Thank you. I do, we do have a list, and I'll make it a part of the record, of all of the, so far, 27 individuals. And I do hope the press and my colleagues will take a good long note, starting with Fernando Rivera, lawyer of the Ministry of Government, And as you go down it, we're talking about very high-level people in the prosecution service who themselves now are in Palomacero prison or under house arrest, and some 5 of them are fugitives. So, you know, the facade of legitimacy has been ripped off. Jacob, sadly, has been the cause or the proximate cause as to why that happened. But on behalf of his family, we all just want him back. And you have done, I think, a huge service to justice, democracy, human rights, and to Jacob Ostreicher. If you have anything you'd like to say in conclusion, or we'll just conclude there.
I just, you know, thank you all. I'm very honored to and grateful to have been able to share the comments.
Thank you, Mr. Penn, and we look forward to working with you in the future. Appreciate it.